Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. We're happy to have you join us for the webinar on Unpacking Children's Involvement in Armed Conflict, the current context in the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and Latin America. My name is Ioana, and I'm with the Care and Protection of Children Learning Network, or CPC as we're more commonly known. CPC Secretariat is housed at Columbia University's program on forced migration and health. And the webinar is hosted in collaboration with Watchlist on Children in Armed Conflict and ChildFundAlliance, and is first in a series of conversations that will take place in 2024. Throughout the conversation, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box, and our panelists will do their best to answer them. I will now hand it off to Dr. Ezequiel Hewiąes, Director of Watchlist, who will be moderating a conversation between our esteemed guest panelists. So over to you, Ezequiel.
Thank you very much, Ioana. My name is Ezequiel Hewiąes. I'm the Director of Watchlist on Children and Conflict. For those who don't know Watchlist, it is a network of human rights and humanitarian organizations working to protect children from the effects of armed conflict. This first webinar of the series of webinars that we are organizing this year is particularly relevant, not only because of the high quality of the speakers that we have present from different perspectives, NGO, institutional perspectives, academia as well, but also it is particularly relevant due to the high number of cases of use and recruitment of children by state and by non-state armed groups that we're seeing around the world. So last week, the Secretary General published his annual report on children and conflict, finding and verifying that around 33 grave violations against children, and out of those 33,000 grave violations against children, 30,000 grave violations were committed in 2023, and about between 8,000 and 9,000 cases of recruitment and use of children took place, mostly by non-state armed groups. So it is particularly relevant to address these issues from various perspectives, and this is why we're here today. So we have 4 speakers with different perspectives, as mentioned. We have Omar Ahmed, who's the head of African region at Geneva Call. We have Shamela Alagendra, who's an international criminal lawyer. Ioana Cismas, who is a professor at York University in the UK and also the principal investigator of the Beyond Compliance Consortium. And we have Ahmed Salem, who is a child protection advisor at Watchlist. So we're going to be discussing different issues. They're going to bring their own perspectives from the work that they've been doing on the issue of recruitment and use of children. And I am very much looking forward to moderating this panel. So first, the first speaker that I would like to ask a question to is Omar. Thank you very much for being with us today. And I would like to hear a bit of your experiences at Geneva Call. You're engaging with armed groups on these specific issues. So if you can share with us the expertise that the organization has, some of the challenges, successes, but also maybe the root causes of use and recruitment of children that you're seeing nowadays in various conflicts. Omar, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Ezequiel, and thanks to Watchlist and to the Columbia University for organizing this very pertinent seminar and for counting on the presence of Geneva Call. So indeed, as you very rightly said, I supervise the programs of Geneva Call in Africa, and maybe I may just remind everyone what Geneva Call does. It's an organization that works to protect civilians, so it's a very, in a way, simple mandate to understand, but with a very unique manner of implementing such a mandate, which is through engagement with armed groups. What does it mean, engagement? Basically, we train armed groups on IHL so that they understand what are the basics of international humanitarian law. We advocate for those armed groups to behave a little bit better and to respect international humanitarian law, and then we sign policy commitments. The most famous instrument that we use, or the tool that we use, is a deed of commitment, so that they actually commit in written that they are going to respect international humanitarian law. So Geneva Call is focusing in 4 or 5 main thematics within IHL, and one of the star thematics is child protection. I say it's one of our star thematics basically because it's one of the oldest and because it's one of the most successful and one of the easiest when it comes to engage an armed group. In many of the environments where we work, engaging an armed group when it comes to highlighting the sexual violence that they perpetrate, or the occupation of civilian infrastructure that they perpetrate, or other violations of IHL, it's often a little bit more sensitive than simply engaging them by telling them that perhaps they have minors on their ranks and that they should prevent such a recruitment. No? So very often they are quite responsive on this thematic, and that happens a little bit in most of the conflicts where I've worked now for 2 years in Africa and before for two years in the Middle East and Latin America. So very often there's a lot of work and it's very difficult to monitor the impact and the results of the engagement that we have with the armed groups. But it happens. We do have impact on this engagement, and we end up, after years of engagement in some instances, after a few hours of discussion in others, we end up having children released from armed groups. We end up having schools who were occupied, vacated by these armed groups. We end up developing the capacity of armed groups to measure the age of the youth that they are recruiting. Very often, these armed groups are located in environments where people don't even have a birth certificate. And we end up allowing access for humanitarian assistance to deliver services to those children that are under the control of the armed groups in question. So it actually goes very much in line with the main priorities of the Children in Armed Conflict report and the mission of the UN. So those are clearly the most important protection concerns perpetrated by armed groups that Geneva Call addresses. Now, in terms of the root causes, actually they are all matching with the main challenges or the main dilemmas that we face when we meet with or when we engage or when we advocate for armed groups to behave better. One of the main ones would be the obvious lack of economic opportunities. So there's no work, there's no income possibilities, so families prefer to send their young children to be associated to an armed group who would probably give them either access to food, either access to cash, either access to any type of power that will translate into power for the father or for the family. In these instances, it happens that very often you have orphans and children that are alone, victims of war. So the armed group is the only authority that remains, the only actor that can actually guide them towards something similar to a future. The second one is the lack of clarity with respect to what is an adult and what is not. So culturally speaking, in many places, as long as you are a teenager with a certain physical appearance, you are considered already as an adult. So that's very difficult to address, because very often armed groups feel in need of recruiting these youth adolescents. Very often you have also young girls who are culturally used to get married before the age of adulthood, and at times that means that they end up being associated to armed groups. So that's another cultural root cause of the association of children into armed groups. And then the obvious lack of education possibilities that conflict environments offer. So I talked before about the lack of income, but there's also a lack of occupation activities that don't necessarily regenerate income as schools and high schools. So when that is not there, sending your kids, your young adolescents, into armed groups is an alternative to criminality. So a lot of families are very happy with that result in a conflict environment. So this is very, very briefly, Ezequiel, the main challenges that we face that are converted very quickly and daily on dilemmas, operational dilemmas on Geneva Call, and that respond and match with the root causes of conflict or the root causes of child recruitment in conflict environments, I would say.
Thank you very much, Omar. If I may ask you a follow-up question before we move to Shamila and the international criminal law perspective, and then we will have at the end, and I should have said this, time for questions and answers from the audience. But maybe if you can share with us what would be for you and for Geneva called engagement in practical sense. What you say, maybe trainings or dissemination sessions or the signing of the deed, but where, for instance, in Africa, in the African context, you have conducted this, and which type of groups, for instance, have you engaged, or they have signed the deeds of commitment, or they have adopted other measures, for instance?
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a good question. I'll start answering the second one. Clearly, the extremist or Islamist or jihadist or terrorist, according to many states, those groups are very difficult to engage. I would say almost impossible, because they're often very hostile to a perceived Western organization like Geneva Call, because they are very secretive and it's very difficult to understand who is in the leadership of these groups and to understand the actual structure, and because ideologically speaking, very often they do not embrace any of the elements of international humanitarian law. It is important to say that many of the Islamic armed groups that we engage following an Islamic dogma that is perhaps conservative, but a little bit less or a little bit more moderate than the so-called jihadist, they do embrace the commonalities in between international humanitarian law and Islamic law, Sharia law, as we say. So in that case, it is possible to engage. No? The other type of groups that are very difficult to engage are criminals. There's a lot of criminal groups. Actually, there's an increasing phenomenon of criminality and organized crime, the armed actors. It's very difficult to engage with them because they don't have a solid structure. They have a very explicit predatory mode of functioning, and therefore it means that they don't have a political ideology or an incentive to be recognized by the international community and to engage with an international organization like Geneva Code. No? And of course, this is a transversal phenomenon that we see in the context where we work. We actually work in conflicts like Sudan, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. So those are the main environments where we work as Geneva Call. And I could say that the dilemmas that I've shared, or the typology of groups that are difficult to engage, are very often transversal. They happen everywhere. And then engagement means that you are often on the ground in the country where you are working. You are meeting with leaders of those groups. Usually those meetings remain rather discreet, and then you start testing their interest on having their combatants behaving better. That's the way you present it. So some of them just want legitimacy. Some of them genuinely want to have their combatants behaving better, because otherwise it doesn't help their purpose. Some of them want to govern people and territory, and it's not healthy for their political plans to have combatants who misbehave. So in that sense, we have a little bit of a space of maneuver and of having potential impact and capacity to trust that what they say is actually what they want to do. But in other cases, they just want to take advantage of the fact that they work with an international organization, and therefore they gain legitimacy, and therefore they may think they could be whitewashing their misbehavior and their IHL violations. So there's a little bit of both. No? Some of them also directly ask if we could help them being removed from the list of listed armed groups in different sanctions list, which of course we cannot. But yeah, just to give you a little bit of a range of different reasons why they would be willing to engage with us.
Excellent. No, thank you very much, Omar, for this overview of the activities, the challenges, and some of the success examples that Geneva Call has had in the past when engaging with non-state armed groups, specifically on this. Now, I wanna move to a different perspective. We have Shamila Hevoiles, who's an international criminal lawyer, an expert on this. And Shamila, I know you have prosecuted the first cases where accused were actually charged and convicted for the recruitment and use of child soldiers back in the Special Court of the Sierra Leone. So it would be fantastic for us to hear some of the challenges that you have encountered when dealing with these cases and how you overcame them.
Thank you, Ezequiel, for the question, and to Watchlist and Columbia University for having me here. I think one of the biggest challenges was proving the age of child soldiers, that they were below the age of 15. But for purposes of our discussion today, what I really wanted to highlight was some of the contextual and cultural issues that arose in the cases that we prosecuted. The Sierra Leone conflict presented what the then UN Secretary General described as a difficult moral dilemma concerning how to address the international crimes committed by children who were both perpetrators and victims. The government of Sierra Leone, local CSOs, they were very, very eager that these children should be held accountable because they strongly believed that the prolonged conflict was due in part to the large number of child soldiers who had committed serious atrocities. And on the other side, we had the international NGOs who were opposed to any kind of criminal proceedings for children who were below 18. So to address this issue, a somewhat balance was struck. The statute of the court eventually granted the court jurisdiction over children between 15 and 18 years. And although the statute limited prosecutions to, and I quote, persons who bear the greatest responsibility, the UN Secretary General actually noted that this term does not necessarily exclude children aged 15 to 18. While children were unlikely to hold political or military leadership positions, the severity of their crimes could warrant prosecution. This was what, the way in which the thinking went. But ultimately, the decision to prosecute these children was left to the prosecutor. And from the very beginning, from the day the doors opened of the OTP, the then prosecutor, David Crane, he declared that these children will be treated primarily as victims. Another issue I wanted to share today, and something, Omar, you had also touched on, arose in the AFRC trial concerning the status of children in the conflict. A defense expert testified about the importance of understanding childhood and the concept of child soldiers within the context of African traditions, which differ from Western perceptions. According to the expert, in traditional African settings, childhood is less about age and more about physical capacity and societal hierarchy. However, all the arguments were heard in the chamber rejected any defense based on cultural distinctions, and they just reaffirmed that under Sierra Leonean law, a child is defined as anyone under 16. Another very interesting issue that arose was in the CDF trial, and that's the Civil Defense Forces. In that case, the prosecution had argued that the traditional initiation process of the Kamajo society for child recruits was akin to enlistment. The court found that initiation alone did not necessarily equate to enlistment, as some parents initiated their children for other reasons, sound cultural old age reasons. So the court examined specifics of each initiation to determine if it constituted enlistment. And the court concluded beyond reasonable doubt that Kondewa, who was the chief priest of the Kamajors, his initiation of boys was indeed comparable to enlisting them for active military service. Sometimes people who talk about the Sierra Leone proceedings talk about culture being on trial, and this was some of the examples. But one of the advantages of the special court in meeting these issues, and one of the main reasons, I think, for our groundbreaking work was its hybrid nature and the critical and leading role played by Sierra Leoneans in all sections of the court. And this was the structure and model which helped us gain a deeper understanding of the cultural and contextual issues involving in prosecuting these kinds of cases, and also importantly, interacting with child soldiers and leading their testimonies in court.
Thank you very much, Abel. I know this is fascinating, and because you also see how other tribunals, either international hybrid courts, they have treated these crimes. So perhaps if you can share with us, what are the gaps that you see nowadays that still exist in terms of accountability at international hybrid tribunals, specifically when dealing with these crimes?
I think the main thing, Ezequiel, is that not all tribunals that had the opportunity to do so prosecuted these crimes. For example, I was a prosecutor in the Special Panel for Serious Crimes in East Timor, and these crimes did not surface at all in our investigations or our prosecutions, despite the fact that there were detailed reports from UNICEF and others indicating that both pro-independence and pro-integration forces in East Timor used children some as young as 10 years old, as combatants during the Indonesian occupation and the post-referendum violence in 1999. And similarly, in the ECCC, there was enough of information out there that these crimes had taken place. Some may recall, for example, Pol Pot's declaration saying it is the youth of today who will take up the revolutionary tasks of tomorrow. And these led to the Cameroon's extensive use of children from the lowest social classes as combatants, including the recruitment of large number of girls who were actually sent to the front lines. We have Netflix documentaries of it, but we never prosecuted these cases. There are also certainly gaps in the way we prosecute these cases. Child soldiers, in our work, in our investigations and prosecutions, are often seen as a homogeneous group with similar characteristics and experiences. Initially, also, it was thought that all child soldiers were boys. The Lubanga trial raised discussions about recognizing sexual violence and other ill treatment suffered by girls and boy soldiers as coming within the legal concept of use to participate actively in hostilities. The law in the ICC has since advanced, and in subsequent cases acknowledging that intra-party crimes against child soldiers, particularly sexual violence and gender-based crimes, can constitute war crimes in both international and non-international armed conflicts. But regrettably, in my view, I think we need to go even further in international prosecutions and include other crimes against child soldiers. Child soldiering itself is a form of slavery. It includes abductions, it amounts to persecution, the severe deprivation of liberty, it's forced labor, children are subjected to torture in these rigorous training regimes. Child soldiers are also victims of human trafficking. Girls are also exploited by armed groups for reproductive labor, bearing and rearing children who become members of the force. This was the policy of the LRA, for example. And child soldiering crimes also involves education-related violations. All of these crimes need to be included in criminal accountability processes. Prosecutions must also highlight the experiences of boy soldiers, including their vulnerability to sexual violence and forced perpetration. In cases, for example, where boy soldiers are ordered to commit rapes, ordered to go into forced marriages, both the boy soldier and his victims should be considered as victims of rape and forced marriages. We must also hold perpetrators accountable criminally for the forced recruitment and use of children aged between 15 and 18. We don't think about them at all when we think of child soldiers, recognizing that they are also victims of the same kind of horrific crimes and harms as those younger than 15, I think, is a real gap which needs to be addressed. Something else I just wanted to say very quickly is that I think a significant challenge in enforcing accountability linked to child soldiering lies in the risk of prosecution of child soldiers themselves in some jurisdictions. In the case of Myanmar, for example, we are seeing trends of recruitment by various actors. And at this point, there's no forum for accountability for post-coup and ongoing crimes, but there is a risk. Should there be cases in national jurisdictions, how are they going to treat these children? We also need to perhaps consider non-judicial accountability. For example, imposing sanctions on corporations that engage in trade with leaders of factions that utilize children as child soldiers. And this, I think, could also serve as a powerful deterrent, not just criminal prosecutions. Thank you, Ezequiel.
Thank you very much, Amela, for this. Yeah, it was very clear, the experiences that you had, but also the alternatives that we might need as deterring use and recruitment of children by armed actors. Now I want to move to Ioana, who I know is going to touch on Myanmar as well, but also who is now leading the Beyond Compliance Consortium. But before, she was leading a project that it was called the Generating Respect Project, focused on the role of religious leaders influencing armed actors on issues related to humanitarian norms, IHL and human rights norms. And I wanted to ask Ioana specifically in terms of how does she see the engagement, not only with armed actors directly and the international criminal prosecution, but also the engagement of other relevant actors towards preventing the use and recruitment of children, and what role do they play on this?
Thank you so much, Ezequiel, for the question and for inviting me today. It's really an honor, especially speaking after Ioana, because what you pointed out is that we need to think about broader strategies of accountability, because the recruitment and use of children is very much steeped into socially constructed and power dynamics. So that therefore we need to look at the actors that have this power in societies, which might be states, but sometimes are not, and sometimes they're not non-state armed groups either. I'm going to give you a few findings, provide a few findings from the Generating Respect project that Ezequiel mentioned before. Our main operational output, that is called Consideration and Guidance for the Humanitarian Engagement with Religious Leaders, is available on the Generating Respect project website. So I invite you to look at that. But I'll specifically focus on some insights relating to Myanmar, and that draws on field work and conceptualization conducted together with the Generating Respect project team, and among them with Chris Rush. So I'll start with a bit of context and focus specifically on the Kachin Independence Army, the KIA. This is the armed wing of the ethnic armed group, the Kachin Independence Organization, and the KIA has been listed by the UN Secretary General as a party that uses and recruits children since 2007. It has documented in the most recent report about 20 cases, which is a reduction. And in the 2017 report, the KIA has been listed as a party that is acknowledged to have put in place measures aimed at improving the protection of children. In the same report, the Secretary General commended the Kachin Independence Army for their engagement with the UN on child protection. And in the 2023 report that just came out a few days ago, the UN Secretary General welcomes the ongoing coordination with KIA towards the reintegration of children and calls upon other armed groups to strengthen their engagement with the UN. So we have a context that is different to what you presented initially in your introduction. We actually have a non-state armed group that is behaving better than the state forces. If you look at the numbers only, which of course obscures the human story and suffering behind, but if you only look at the numbers, the difference is we're talking about thousands of children used and recruited by the Tatmadaw against numbers that are still important, but of non-state armed groups, including the KIA. So why did we see this, the start to address the situation of use and recruitment of children by the KIA? Our research indicates that in the last decade plus, there has been increased awareness of international standards of this issue among key stakeholders. This includes the non-state armed groups, but it has occurred in engagement, often very deep, sustained, sometimes informal, or we don't know about it necessarily, it doesn't appear in the news that often, between some UN actors, but also, and this is really important, local NGOs and local religious leaders. Again, our research has found that the Kachin Baptist Convention has played an important role among other religious actors in relation to the KIA and KIO. One key informant interview told us that many strong church actors and players that influence the decisions of the leaders are within the Kachin Baptist Convention. Another one said that the KIO rely very much on the KBC for their support. It might not be the same, it might even lose its standing without the support of the KBC. So it shows that in our key informant interviews, it became clear that there is an influence of this institutional religious actor and individual religious leaders on the KIA, and there were direct links to the change in policy or the positive steps in relation to use and recruitment of children. So the question that we asked, and this was the question in the wider research that dealt with 6 case study countries, not just Myanmar, was why religious actors? What makes them influential? What we found is that religious leaders in many contexts, but by no means all, claim to enjoy a special legitimacy. And it's special because it's anchored in charisma and in tradition, as opposed to what we're used to, parliaments or courts. Their legitimacy is very much rational legal. So they tap into other sources of legitimacy. But legitimacy alone, we found in our research, does not explain the influence of religious leaders on state and non-state parties to armed conflicts in relation to compliance or non-compliance. Much rather, this influence is a relational process that is shaped both by endogenous factors to both religious leaders and armed actors, and this can include shared values, objectives, ideology, ethnic, cultural, or social background, organizational structure, access and communication channels, and their respective positions on international humanitarian norms. But also this relational process can be shaped by contextual factors, including conflict dynamics and the perception of religious leaders and armed actors of each other and by third parties. So to come back to the Myanmar example really briefly, what we found is that the KIO, KIA, and Baptist Convention, they shared a religious belief. Baptists are predominant within the ranks of the KIO and particularly within the KIA. However, we don't think this is the sole explanatory factor, and we caution actually against essentializing this shared religion as the only explanation for why this specific actor is influential on the KIO/A. We think it's the shared culture and shared suffering as another element, as another endogenous factor that plays a strong role. The fact that the church in the Kachin state has played a key role in promoting and teaching the Kachin language as a way of resistance against the Bamarization of this ethnic minority. The fact that the religious institution is steeped into the societal structure in the KIO, KIA. They provide aid, they provide support, and they very often share the violations that they are subjected to by the Tatmadaw, for example. Another interesting and somewhat contradictory to other studies finding relates to the structure of the armed group itself. So I'm going to end on this. The KIO and KIA are heavily militarized, and their political structures are highly hierarchical in comparison with many other ethnic armed groups, and also in general with many other non-state armed groups in other contexts. So this would suggest that any kind of external influence would be minimal by a religious leader, because we tend to think of religious leaders as external. However, it's the history of the KIO, and particularly a rebellion against the previous leadership that was viewed as self-serving, that has meant that the KIO has made efforts to be more sensitive to the views of the wider Kachin society, and among them the religious actors that are legitimate in this society. So in a sense, the religious leader is external, but at the same time, it remains highly influential because of the openness and the consultation process within the KIA. I will end here. If you have any further questions, there are of course other factors that we have explored, but what I would say is that religion itself, the shared religion, shouldn't be essentialized as the one explanatory factor of why in some circumstances religious leaders may be influential and may even, as was this particular case, result in changes in policies regarding use and recruitment of children.
Thank you very much, Ioana, for sharing these insights of the research that you have conducted, not only in Myanmar, but also covering other contexts. It's interesting to see these various avenues to engage and to try to obtain better scenarios, better outcomes for children affected by armed conflict. Now I would like to give the floor to Ahmed Salem, who's the Child Protection Advisor specializing on children associated with armed groups and armed forces at ChildFundAlliance. Who, I expect he's going to bring a different perspective of other actors to be engaged with on this specific situation. Ahmed, over to you.
Thank you, Ezequiel, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Indeed, Ezequiel, working with CAFAG is really multifaceted and very complex. And the perspective that I want to share with you today is some insights from the field on the practical reintegration of children who were associated with armed groups. So, War Child, of course, I come from ChildFundAlliance, and War Child has made a decision to work on the most vulnerable children, notably those who have been associated with armed groups. And we focused on reintegrating these, and we worked in DRC, Central African Republic, Colombia, and other places. But most recently, we've been working on reintegrating children, CAFAG children in Iraq, which was a very challenging context because of, obviously, of all the security and the securitization, like you said, Ezequiel, of this issue. So in Iraq, you probably all know that ISIS, insurgents lasted between 2014 to 2017, and they, devastated the already challenged state in Iraq. They created an unprecedented crisis, and this led the government to request assistance from the humanitarian system. Now, during the control of ISIS, so what they did is that they destroyed what they said that they destroyed the artificial borders between Syria and Turkey, and what happened as a result of that is that individuals and communities, they were forced to be displaced from one place to another across the two sides of the border. But then back in 2018, later in 2018, when ISIS was defeated, the borders were reinstated, and many children who were in Syria, Iraqi children who were in Syria, needed to go back. Many of them went back, but also a great number of them were put in detention centers in Syria and Iraq. And many of these children were either actually affiliated with ISIS, and many of them were only perceived to have been affiliated with ISIS. Many of them actually were born amid this turmoil, and they know nothing about life. They don't know anything about ISIS. But then when they returned to Iraq, they were viewed only as ISIS children. And now working on reintegrating these children has proven very challenging because, first of all, the level of stigma against those people the levels of stigma were extremely high. Many host communities viewed these children as affiliated with ISIS and their families, and they even did not want to talk about the idea of having these returnee families joining back their communities. These families were living in complete ostracization, and nobody wanted them back. The legal framework itself was not helping at all. Although Iraq has, the national government has issued some, has been influenced to issue some amnesty towards these children and families, but in fact, many localized governance structures refused to give these children their documents, and they wanted proofs that these children were Iraqi. They requested documents that can by no way be obtained. Many families were asked, like, because one of their family members was believed to be associated with ISIS, so they were asked to disown their family member. So if there is a mother of 3 children and she wanted to issue documents for her children, in order to do so, she had to disown her missing husband. And she claimed that she has absolutely no relationship to him and that the children will be completely severed in terms of relations, whether he is alive or dead, etc. So the level of discrimination against these children was extreme, and everybody seemed to be supportive of that. And when we said that, okay, let's try to work on this issue, everybody said, okay, listen, what you're doing is a big mistake, because although those children have and their families have wreaked enormous havoc on Iraq and our communities, and now you are rewarding them. And we know that many of you NGOs are here only to support these children. You're only supporting terrorism. You're only supporting those who have killed and have massacred and have wreaked havoc. And you're not supporting us. And of course, the situation, the context in Iraq, people there are in extreme levels of need. The needs are still huge. There is huge levels of unemployment. People are really living in poverty in that place. And then they're saying, you are punishing us for not carrying arms, for not participating in the atrocities, and you are rewarding those who have actually committed crimes. So the whole approach for us, which was previously rights-based approach, like we were advocating that these children are children, they cannot be prosecuted, they need to be treated as victims, etc. Now, this whole approach faced a very strong obstacle and barrier. I'm sorry, not one, but many obstacles and barriers, and at various levels, like at the legislative, at the practical, at the community acceptance level, etc. So what we did is that we did some research and discussions, and we found that our approach is not really ideal, because, to be honest, like, we did not take into consideration the other part, because when we're talking about reintegration, we're not talking simply about one party, which is children. We're also talking about another party, which is the communities themselves, and we need to take their interests and their concerns, and we need to validate their experiences, the tragedies they lived, etc., into our consideration. And that's why we altered our approach, and we said, oh, listen, you're absolutely right, and we think that we did not follow the right approach, and we think that what you went through really needs much better attention. And so, but again, like, let's together work on a solution, because these children, like you've been telling us, are timed bombs. And we don't agree with that, right? But we're just trying to say, like, if you see these children and families as a future threat for you, then what is the best way we can reintegrate? What are your prerequisites for having these children reintegrated into your community? Because if they're not reintegrated, like, we also did some role playing, like in one of the case role plays that I designed, I said, like, okay, you are, let's say, Ahmed, a child, 14 years old. You were born in Syria, but you are Iraqi. You don't know anything about what happened in the war, etc. You were brought back to Iraq, but everybody's pointing at you as a criminal, as a murderer, although you have not committed any crime. You've lived most of your life in tents and in displacements, running from bombardment and killing and etc. Now, how would you feel towards the community that you are in? And then what would happen if a shift of power happens? Like, will you be merciful towards those people, or will you be trying to actually punish them for not? And then we brought, the famous African proverb that a child who is not protected by his village, like well cared for by his village, will burn it to feel its worth. So I don't know really how to put it, but that was the idea. So so then they felt that unless we reintegrate these children and families, we're really actually facing, like, running a risk of having this, backfiring. Only then that the community started to believe, and even some of the local authorities, that they started to see the things that we can see. So what I'm trying to say here is that following solely a rights-based approach can be an incomplete approach. You have to always take into consideration the perspective of the community and their concerns, etc. And they started to see things the way that we see it, and they started with us to find and work on solutions for reintegrations. They started to spell out their fears. And, once we started talking about this issue, which was more of a taboo, like even if there were people who believed that some of these children are innocent, etc., they were intimidated to speak about these issues publicly because they were afraid that people will see that person as an affiliate, with ISIS, or like they have hidden. Also, because also of the sectarian issues, we also work with other sects, like the Shia, for example, who were seen as neutral in the ISIS case because it's never imagined for a Shia person to support ISIS. So we're also, and that takes us, Ioana, back to the issue of religious leaders, like the Shia leaders, for example. They were very influential when we spoke to some of them, and when they said, you're absolutely right, like, these are children, maybe these families also are need to be reintegrated because this is the only way forward. It's only then that we started to also see some progress. Like, once we started this dialogue with the community and actively involve them together with the local authorities, that we started to come up with practical, pragmatic solutions, and we started to see some breakthrough in this impasse that we were in. And now we are doing like some evaluation of the impact of the project, and we've seen that there is a significant shift in the people's perspective about what needs to happen to these children and families. Now they see that, yes, these children need to be reintegrated in the communities, but only as law-abiding citizens. And we said, yes, we agree with you, and we need to also include within our maybe curricula or reintegration approach some training on, legal responsibility and some of these keeping in initiatives. Over.
Thank you very much, Ahmed, for sharing this. It's very good to put I would say case studies into the problem of reintegration, and when there is a lack of reintegration, this threat of having perpetrate cycles of violence, and how conflicts actually continue without achieving peace. So I would like to encourage the audience to ask questions. We have a couple of minutes. I see that we have 3 questions. So the first question, actually, I'm gonna start with you, Ahmed. I'm gonna put you on the spotlight here because there is a colleague from Turkey asking about specific case studies or reports on child soldiers and human trafficking that specifically consider the Romani Gypsy community during the ISIS conflict and other armed groups during the Iraqi war. So I'm asking you first, but then I'm going to open if any of the other colleagues have thoughts on this. And then for the second question, I'm going to put Shamila on the spotlight here because Emilia is asking about accountability and practical integration in the context of Latin America, in Colombia specifically. And well, now I see that we have a lot of other questions coming up. And then we have, so this I think is to Ioana, what lessons were learned as a KIA in terms of the KIA case that you mentioned before. And so let's start with these 3 questions, and then we can keep going with the others. Ahmed, you want to go first since you were the last speaker?
Absolutely. So greetings, Aslı, and it's nice seeing you here webinar. So I think that this is a very interesting question, and for years and maybe for decades, the Roma gypsies have been what shall I say? Like they were invisible to all sorts of statistics and what's not. And it's no wonder that I could not come across any like maybe assessment or research that focuses on or even mentions what happened to the gypsies and Roma that I know for sure have existed somewhere in along the Iraqi, Syrian, areas that were controlled by ISIS. So it's a bit of a gap, and thank you so much for pointing to that. I know that, for example, Yazidis have received lots of attention, lots of like the Kurdish, communities, like many communities have actually the Kakai have received lots of attention, but for some reason the Roma gypsies, I don't think that no Romas and no gypsies at all were involved in these, but I think this is another episode of their systematic disappearance from general life in the Middle East. So thank you for pointing to that, and let's keep that conversation going. But also, if anyone is aware of different information, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ahmed. Shamila, thoughts on the accountability process in Latin America and maybe on Colombia?
I'm so sorry, but I'm going to have to plead ignorance on as far as it concerns Latin America, and I'm going to ask maybe some of the other panelists who are more informed. My apologies.
No, don't worry, don't worry. So maybe I can jump in just saying that there is a special jurisdiction for peace actually in Colombia now that has dealt with different cases, and one of them that is dealing is on protection of children and youth and recruitment. So it is a system that was established in Colombia after the peace agreement was signed in 2016. And it is dealing with cases of youth and recruitment during the conflict that ended in 2016. Ioana, may I give you the floor next?
Yes. I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I'm going to try to rephrase it, and hopefully I'm addressing it. And if not, please feel free to follow up with me on email. You can find me on the university's website. So I think if you mean concerns, what concerns could there be if we're focusing? So our project really looked at, should humanitarian practitioners engage with religious leaders, and why should they do that? And what we found is that in many contexts, religious leaders are influential, such as in the context of the KIA in relation to child recruitment and youth norms. So definitely they should engage with them. Now, you can't expect that you'll have a perfect translation of the humanitarian norms through the religious leaders in the local context. This is not how life works, how anything works, and certainly not how it works with religious leaders. They are on the ground, they have a social capital, a political capital, definitely the KBC has. At times, they might even put forward messages that look like they are providing excuse for violations of human rights and IHL, and those need to be understood. But and one needs to engage with them to understand that. And in order to shift and to make any change, that engagement needs to occur. So in a sense, the argument that we're very much supporting through this project, and for which we bring evidence, and including in the case of the KIA and KBC, is the one that we had made 20, 30 years ago when it comes to non-state armed groups. If you actually want to change their behavior, you need to engage with them. What we're saying now is, if you want to change the behavior of non-state armed groups and state armed groups, you also need to engage with their influencers. Religious leaders can be some of those influencers. They're not the only ones. Some are tribal leaders. And one thing that I just want to mention shortly is that we found, and this is surprising perhaps for many, that religious leaders really we need to take our Western secularized glasses off when we're talking about religious leaders. In the context of Mali, for example, we found that female religious leaders acting through networks have a giant influence potential that is completely invisibilized, and that's socially constructed by the way Western humanitarian and development organizations are working. So we need to see this possible influential actors, engage with them, and then we'll see in what that translates. But it's not necessarily a positive that it will emerge necessarily.
Thanks, Ioana. I have a question for Omar now, that it's in terms of the dialogue and engagement with armed groups and the reintegration of children into communities. If you have some thoughts on the effectiveness of this dialogue, and I mean, the specific question is what has been the evaluation approaches to that effectiveness?
Well, that's a difficult, that's a very difficult question. It really depends from context to context. As Ahmed said, there's a lot of resistance in certain communities who see these children reintegrated in their communities as a threat. It happens in environments where those children have been associated to so-called terrorist or jihadist or Islamist armed groups. But then in others where the armed groups are very much interconnected with the communities and to a certain extent supported by the communities, like in other African environments, if I may say, perhaps Darfur in Sudan or certain areas in South Sudan or the DRC, I think children are better accepted in the communities. And then, of course, this analysis needs to be done on a very local manner. And then a village or a town can vary from another one. But perhaps I could do that very simplistic type of separation, no? When it comes at least to the African environment where we work. On the one side, if you're considered as a terrorist and having perpetrated terrorist actions, then you're less welcome to be back home. It happens in Nigeria, for example, with Boko Haram reintegrated children. And if you have been part of an armed group that defends or that claims to defend the interest of the communities, you're perhaps most welcome, but you need to go through a certain level of scrutiny that will see what type of behavior have you had while you were a child in the community, in the groups that recruited you. No? So, and that will determine the way you will be potentially integrated.
Thank you, Omar. So we're running out of time, so I'm gonna ask the same question to all the panelists. And it's specifically, I mean, I know that there are other questions that unfortunately we're not going to be able to address. Having said that, this is the first of the webinars that we're putting together. So there are going to be other opportunities to engage on these issues in future webinars. But the common question for everyone is regarding the situation of children in detention in Northeast Syria. But I would perhaps add it as a general issue in terms of children in detention, if I may. Either by non-state armed groups or by state in relation to their association to the armed conflict. So I would be curious to hear your views on what to do with the situation of children in detention. And if you have thoughts, if you have engaged with actors on this. And I know that this might touch on the different aspects that you have dealt with in your respective presentations. So I'm gonna start maybe with, I don't know, shall we go with Ioana? Do you want to go first, or you want to go first, Omar?
I do have a very quick reaction to this, and perhaps since I had the word, maybe I can just complete them. So Geneva Call has been engaging indeed with the self-defense forces in the Northeast, and we've been trying to mediate and negotiate the return of some of those families into areas. Their areas of origins or other areas that could be considered as areas that accept them, no? Usually led by different Arab tribes. and it is a very securitized issue for the obvious reasons. So it is extremely difficult. There is a lot of challenges and a lot of, in a certain extent, understandable resistance from the Kurdish authorities. But I know we're not the only ones, and there's other actors trying this. There's even state actors trying this. To finish in a positive manner, there are some cases of success of some children and some families who have been actually allowed to return to certain areas and are not persecuted anymore.
Thank you, Omar. Shamila?
Yeah, just to add my voice again, sometimes accountability and really demonstrating through our prosecutions and how these children are actually victims and not perpetrators can also support reintegration. And I think we saw that in Sierra Leone, where they started off totally looking at children as perpetrators. But by the time we finished the trial process, I think the community understood the horrific manner in which they were recruited and made to commit some of these crimes actually turned them into victims. And that really assisted, I think, reintegration very positively.
Thank you, Shamila. Ioana?
If I may just add, and I'm thinking specifically of children that are perceived to be affiliated with ISIS and whose mothers tend to come from Western Europe or North America. And I think this discussion that we're having is a discussion that we have to continue having with our own governments in the global north as well. Repatriation is what we should be looking for. The reminder that my colleague, the previous speaker just mentioned, is that we should work on our own accountability as well, and to understand that that must be broader than just criminal justice processes. And certainly it must be broader than just leaving them where they are and completely denying any kind of responsibility. I have a PhD student who works on that topic, so I'm looking forward to her finalized book soon.
Thank you very much, Ioana. And Ahmed?
Yeah, I think the main challenge comes from the fact that we are more inclined towards working on one set of rights rather than the other. So for these children, we know that they have rights, and we know that repatriation is what needs to happen. But also, we need to take into consideration that also the communities into which they should be repatriated have also the rights to have their fears and, concerns taken into consideration and addressed. So I think a balanced approach should probably help bring the rights of these children into fulfillment. So when I talk about these things, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be following rights-based approach. I'm just trying to find a way to bring, to provide practical solutions, because focusing on that sometimes just leads to, as I said before, to an impasse where, we keep talking about child rights, but then in the end, nothing really of these rights is realized. So if we want to actually, if we are genuine about the realization of these rights, we need to also be very pragmatic. We need to really be able to see the concerns, the barriers that are that prevent the realization of these rights, and address these in a manner that suits probably the needs of and rights of everyone. Okay.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. So I would like to thank you and thank Shamila, Ioana, and Omar for your interventions, for sharing your expertise today with everyone. And just to remind you all that this is the first of the webinars that we are organizing this year. So more discussions on child protection issues in armed conflict are going to take place during the year. Very relevant because of the numbers that we see that are unprecedented. Very relevant as well in terms of the needs of children in armed conflict. Northeast Syria, but we've heard of other situations: Myanmar, Sudan, South Sudan, the DRC, Latin America, and Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. So we all know very well how much these discussions are needed and how much it is needed to look for avenues that can serve to better protect children affected in armed conflict. So thanks everyone for the great panel. Thanks also for the audience, to the audience for the questions, and please stay tuned for the future webinars. Thank you very much.